Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk about the future of agriculture. We have, over the past 10 to 12,000 years, become masters of various plants and animals, and our population is 7.5 billion almost, because we are so amazing at producing food. And lots of countries produce lots of food, and in particular, the United States produces probably more food than any other country. Every region produces its own food. Now, not all regions produce enough food for each country to be food secure, and so there's lots of imported food. But all around the world, we're producing huge amounts of food, right? Here's the catch, though. We need, for areas that are not food secure, to be producing enough food for them to be secure. And we've got to feed 2 billion more people. So we're going to have to look seriously into three big areas. That is food technology, and in particular biotechnology. We need to get higher yields with less space. We need to use fewer chemicals. We need to have higher nutritional value. We need to use less water. We need to conserve good soil, always have good soil. And somehow, even though we don't have any more land, we've got to increase growing spaces. So we're going to need students that are well versed in engineering, science, and technology, in particular, the agricultural sciences. So what we're really talking about in terms of the future of agriculture is we're talking about sustainable agriculture. Now I want to start with soil conservation because the foundation of any agriculture is good soil. Whether you are talking about raising plants or raising animals, you have got to have good soil to do it, right? You've got to maintain your soil productivity, and you do it with conservation techniques ranging from things like drip irrigation, which I'll talk about, to how you're planting, what you're planting, how you're tilling, right? If you do this, you will maintain a healthy ecological balance. That healthy ecological balance is very important. Think about bees. Bees don't live in the crops. They come to the crops to pollinate them. 80% of the crops grown in the United States are pollinated by bees. So without a healthy ecosystem surrounding the agricultural lands, we don't have a healthy population of bees. With no healthy population of bees, we don't have good crops. Now, later on, we'll talk about the bee epidemic. Is the bee problem as bad as people say? We'll see. We'll analyze that, right? That's what we like to do. We like to take an issue and then we like to look at the facts. So we'll figure that out later. But it is an example. If you don't have a good ecosystem, right, you don't have good crops. We have to minimize the long-term impacts of the things that we are doing, right, like pollution. Yeah. And we have to use water sustainably. We can't just continue to withdraw without ever replacing. So let's start with soil conservation. One of the easiest ways to conserve soil is to prevent soil erosion. Terracing, contour planting, strip cropping, and alley cropping, in addition to windbreaks, can all reduce soil erosion. Terracing is one of the oldest things that we do. This is occurring on hillsides. It is great to prevent erosion as long as there are root systems in place, because now you have flat root systems that hold soil. I would like to put an asterisk next to this one, though, because it is very possible that you can increase soil erosion by terracing if you do not keep root systems in place. So there's a danger after you harvest your crop and the root systems are gone or weak, that you could increase soil erosion if you have lots of rain, right? Which is what happened in 1997 in China, because they terraced all the hillsides. There was an El Nino year. There was a massive increase in precipitation, tons of erosion, tons of flooding. It was a real problem, okay? So terracing works as long as the root system is there. Contour planting is where you don't level the field, you don't lose the topsoil, you actually go with the lay of the land. That is great for maintaining good topsoil. Strip cropping, which you see in this picture, is where you plant a thin strip, right, of one crop and then the next and then the next. Then you go back to the original, then the next one, then back to the original. This goes to that polyculture that we've talked about in other conversations. You also have alley cropping. Alley cropping is another example of polyculture. And usually you'll do a tall crop, then a short crop, then a tall crop, and then a short crop. And you see this with the strip cropping as well. You do something tall and then short and tall and then short. Anytime you have tall and short, it acts like a windbreak. And here are dedicated windbreaks. What that does is slows the breeze as it comes through, and so it doesn't pick up all of the topsoil that's dry, right? Well, why does topsoil get dry? Partly it has to do with tilling, right? So if you look at this, you have all of this moist, dark soil here that's turned over by this tiller, right? You have a plow. This is going to dry out. Once it dries out, it's susceptible to blowing and washing away, right? So this is not something that is really beneficial to soil conservation. What we've done is tried to shift and are continuing to try and shift to conservation tillage, which is also called no-till or minimum tillage, because modern farm machinery is extremely sophisticated, actually, and you can plant crops without disturbing the soil at all, which is great because you increase the crop yield because you leave the nutrients in the soil, you raise the carbon content in the soil, which is now accessible as it decomposes. It's accessible to the plants there. It's great, right? And you have water conservation because the soil's not constantly drying out. You can use less water. You can use fewer chemicals because the crop residue, that's what you're seeing here that's been just left on the fields, oftentimes prevents pesticides or pests from getting into the soil. And then if you think about just the act of plowing, dragging this blade through the ground, takes a lot of effort. Well, a lot of effort in a machine translates to a lot of fuel. So you can actually conserve fuel and release fewer emissions. Okay, so compared to conventional tillage farming, conservation tillage, this is to review, reduces soil erosion, requires more fuel, releases more carbon dioxide to the air, or reduces crop yields. It actually reduces soil erosion, if you were paying attention at all, right? It reduces soil erosion. That's the key to conservation tillage. Now, part of sustainable agriculture can be organic, right? Now, I just want to specify what organic is and say, one, organic doesn't always mean more sustainable. For instance, in water usage, organic agriculture oftentimes isn't more sustainable. It uses as much water. It does use some pesticides. It does use fertilizer. It's just that when we talk about organic agriculture, we're talking about no, quote, non-natural chemicals, so none of the inorganic fertilizers, none of those really toxic pesticides, and the part that's a little bit more controversial is no genetic engineering. Now, that in itself may be a boon or it may be a negative, right, to organic farming. It depends on what you think about genetic engineering and its role in the future of agriculture, which we'll talk about in just a second. But more often than not, organic farming is associated with sustainable agriculture, and the practices are usually more in line with sustainable agriculture. So here's a little bit about organic farming. You can check this out, right? So remember, one of the big things about farming is pesticide, right? We talk about fertilizers, we talk about water usage, and those are big deals. But pesticides, you're putting poisons into the environment. Sustainable agriculture, in a large part, is about soil conservation, yes, but also decreasing pesticide usage. And it turns out that biotech, so far, has been our best tool in reducing pesticides. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about what does GMO mean. So here's your next question. In order to create animals that have characteristics of both species, people have bred buffalo and cattle together. What is this an example of? Well, it's actually not genetic engineering. It is genetic manipulation, right? We're taking two species together, which would be hybrid, right? The outcome of that is a hybrid, so it's hybridization. And we are trying to get the gene makeup that we want in this new species. And this is something we have done for thousands of years. We have manipulated the genes of things. That is what domestication is, for instance. We have done this, but we've done it very clumsily. We've taken all the genes, rolled the dice, and just, gotten what we've gotten over and over again until we get something we like, right? Think about corn. We started out with teosinte, right, which is that little, wheat-like thing, and we eventually, through breeding the things that we like, looking for traits that we like, we eventually get corn, right? Great. But there's a more precise way to do it, and you can make predictions about the outcome better. You can get just the genes that you want, and that is genetic engineering. We are moving genes from one species or one variety to another, and this has real benefits for agriculture. I'm going to put in here this slide so you can kind of just see how it works, and then this slide so you can see what do we actually do when we talk about genetic engineering. What I want you to understand are the pros and cons and how they relate to the environmental impact of agriculture. That's what I want you to know, okay? So what is the reason, thinking environmentally, farmers would cultivate GMO crops, right? Does it increase yields? Does it decrease pesticide input costs? Does it save management time? Well, it does all of these things, right? There are huge benefits that we've seen so far to GM crops. And I'd like to say, in terms of future of agriculture, one of the potentials for GM crops that we have not really fully realized is the decrease in nutritional deficiencies worldwide. We could actually take something like golden rice, which I'll talk about later on. This has a daffodil gene in it that makes this rice fortified. It's not fortified, that means something different, but it has vitamin A in it. Think about all of the vitamin A deficiency blindness cases that you could have prevented if you could have given children rice with vitamin A in it, right? What about giving kids things that have higher protein, right? That have more vitamins, whatever, right? But we could really make that higher nutritional value happen, and the only way right now that we know of to do that would be to actually insert those genes from other things. Remember, I told you golden rice, that vitamin A comes from a daffodil. Now, what we are doing right now is decreasing inputs. We're decreasing pesticides in particular, but we can also decrease water and fertilizer usage. We can get hardier plants, things that are drought tolerant, salt tolerant, cold tolerant. And ultimately, when we put all of this stuff together, it means that we can grow more stuff in less space in other areas that we weren't growing before. And that means that we could potentially feed a lot more people. And it's not just plants. We can also make more productive farm animals. Ultimately, you have the possibility of achieving more sustainability because of these pluses and decreasing those inputs, and you end up decreasing pressure on ecosystems because of the decreased usage of water, fertilizer, and pesticides, and because of all of that, you decrease pollution. So there are huge benefits to GM crops. The three biggest crops that you would experience GM-wise are going to be soybeans, cotton, and corn. And really most of the traits that you see in your daily life are going to be centered around herbicide resistance and pesticide production. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So what percent of foods in U.S. markets are estimated to contain at least one ingredient that's derived from a GM crop? Turns out it's at about 70%. So you're exposed to GM products way more often than you think you are. And mostly it is true, though, that most GM crops are grown in developed or mostly developed nations. And so this is where you're going to see them the most. And we grow a lot of them in the United States. Really, like I said, most of the traits are going to deal with pests. The biggest threat to food security is pests. We lose so much of our yield. And if you look at this, right, versus the non-pest infested corn, you can see why. So ultimately, when we look at desirable traits in GMOs, here are some things that we've already input. These are things that are available, maybe not on the market, but they are pretty close to being either done or they are already available. The pest resistance, the herbicide resistance, the delayed ripening, miniature size, right? These are all things that you already see. Cold resistance, they're working on, right? Vaccines they're working on. We'll talk about that in a second. Probably the most famous of the traits in GM products are going to be the pesticide production. And that's going to be the BT cotton, BT corn, right? These are products that are grown on a regular basis. They have a gene from a soil bacteria. it's in all the soil there. It actually is essentially a deterrent. It's a pest deterrent, right? And so it produces this protein that pests don't like, so they don't eat the plant, right? Again, this is the most common. It's the one that you're going to encounter in your life most frequently. Now, there is a concern about having a crop that produces a pesticide. And there are some legitimate questions that go with that. Would this pesticide that is naturally produced now by these plants, would it harm non-target species? You have a pesticide that's being used all the time and you can't stop using it. So is it going to work like antibiotics and antibacterial stuff where you end up creating superbugs? All the ones who are resistant survive, right? Little forced evolution there. And the question becomes, is it something that's going to be able to drift to non-GMO fields? And this actually is a question about all GM products. Does it drift into other things, right? And the answer is we work really hard on that to not do that. Most GM products actually are sterile, and so they can't have offspring, they can't pollinate with other things. That is intentionally done so you do the best that you can to prevent this drift. Now, having said that, there was a case where Starlink corn, right, which is an herbicide-resistant version of corn, ended up in human food. It also turns out that Starlink corn is safe for consumption, and so every GM product that is on the market that's available for purchase has been tested and shown to be safe for consumption. It's tested for a minimum of 10 years, and it has to show that it doesn't produce any allergens, it doesn't produce any unintended side effects, that it doesn't make anybody sick or anything like that. So this would be the smallest of the problems, right, if it were to happen. But there is a huge effort to prevent that drift from happening. Now, in terms of the resistant insects, this is a possibility. But one of the things that happens is that there are different versions of the pesticide producing plants, and so farmers can alternate them, and so you're not targeting the pests the exact same way each time, and so resistance isn't able to build up. That's a great way to minimize that risk. Now, what about harming non-target species? There was a big deal, and there's a documentary about Monsanto versus the monarch butterfly, that BT corn was killing all of these monarch butterflies. And it turns out that the BT corn actually doesn't kill bees or butterflies, right? So this is not true. It turns out that what kills monarch butterflies is not having any milkweed environments because they've all been paved over, or urban sprawl has gotten rid of them, or agriculture itself has eliminated the wild milkweed habitats. That's what happened to monarchs, and we're still not 100% sure what's happening to bees. We still really don't know why there is a decline in bees and what that means. And so again, we're going to analyze bees specifically later on. But this actually turns out to not be true, and yet it still persists in the collective consciousness about GM products, and it's completely false. We are killing monarch butterflies for an entirely different reason. Okay, another thing, disease-resistant crops. Most of the little guys that you get here, if they are not organic, have a GM on this list. If they're not organic, if you're not buying organic, they do have a gene that will make them resistant to blight or rust or whatever disease viruses they happen to get. Now, the next trait is herbicide resistance. This is the one that probably is most controversial in terms of what the outcome is, right? Herbicide-resistant crops do not die when an herbicide is sprayed on them. Okay, so why would you spray herbicide on your crops? Well, you wouldn't, but you get weeds growing with your crops, because if the soil is great for your crop, it's great for weeds. And so you really have to till over after you've grown your crop to kill any weeds that are remaining. And, right, you have to go in, it's high maintenance, you're trying to use herbicides. So what's happened is there are some plants that will allow for herbicide spraying without dying, so it kills the weed and it doesn't kill the plant. And this sounds great, and in a lot of ways it is great, but the downside of the herbicide-resistant crop is that it encourages the use of herbicide. right? Now, does that mean that farmers are spraying more herbicides simply because they can? No, they aren't, right? They're not. People are not like, woohoo, my crops will die. I'm just going to lay it down there. I mean, maybe some people are, but that's not a very effective way to farm because herbicides cost money, and so they're going to spray only as much as they need to. Having said that, though, there may be other ways, other GM traits that might be more beneficial. So this one does actually have some downside in terms of the fact that it does not limit pesticides, right? It doesn't limit pesticide use, but it does increase yield, and we really do like that, okay? It also allows for no-till, right? So conservation tillage. Okay. Now, here's the other thing. Do you create super weeds? Again, it's got the same issues as creating super pest. They are all sterile, and so you really don't have a lot of potential for super weeds. Is there cross-pollination? Maybe, but since they're all sterile, it's shouldn't be a huge issue. The other downside of sterility, by the way, is that means that farmers have to buy new seed every year. They can't save some of their crop. This is really a downside for people in developing nations who will buy a certain amount of seed and then they'll go from year to year by setting aside seed to grow next year. You can't do that with GM crops because they have to be sterile so they don't infiltrate the plants or animals around them. All right, now let's get back to that increasing nutrition thing that I said was one of the really big potentials. I said, well, this is not something that we are doing, except I showed you a picture of golden rice, and I told you all about this great vitamin A deficiency thing. Golden rice is ready to go. It has a beta-carotene gene, has the vitamin A. This is the first GM product that would not only help farmers out, but it would also help the consumer. Most of the traits right now are on the input side as opposed to the output side. This is an output side trait. It would be huge. This is the guy who made it, and it will probably not ever get on the market. This is very expensive. Making a GM product can cost billions of dollars. If you are making a product that is not going to make billions of dollars, you are not going to recoup your money, and so it is very difficult to sometimes get funding for all of the stages of testing and research for your products. They are paused in the third phase of testing. And so they're waiting on money. They're waiting on grants. This has been around for years, right? This has been around for decades. And yet it's not on the market, right? And that is another thing that is a little bit challenging about GM products. They're expensive to develop, very expensive to develop. All right, so what was the first genetically modified crop to be sold in supermarkets in the United States? Flavor Saver tomato that lasts longer, Starlink corn that's herbicide resistant, golden rice, which is not on the market, or transgenic salmon. Wait, transgenic salmon. Do we have that? It's actually the Flavor Saver tomato. It has a longer shelf life. You can still buy them in the market today. But let's get back to that salmon. The Aqua Bounty salmon was just approved. It grows twice as fast, or 2 or 4 times as fast, I can't remember, as regular salmon. But that got approved to be on the market in 2017, right? 2017, 2018. And so that is our first marketable animals. So there are transgenic animals. You can enhance growth rates like in the salmon. You can have less fat, more fat. You can have more nutrition in your milk. You can have more nutrition just in general, right? And you can also produce human proteins. We already do that in bacteria, but you could do it in animals too. You can especially do it in milk. Think spider goats. There are goats that produce spider silk in their milk. Very cool. All right, and on the nutrition thing, let's shift quickly to edible vaccines. These work like any vaccine. It's just that they would be in a plant, and you would have kids eat the plant, right? And then they would be able to produce the antibodies against the pathogen that is in, whatever virus it is. And so then humans would be immunized against the pathogen, just like getting a shot. The benefit of this is that you don't need medical training. You don't have to properly store the vaccines. Like vaccines have to be refrigerated and stuff, right? So this is a little bit difficult to always get them to places. And you can grow them yourself within the country. So cool stuff. There is current focus on hepatitis B and measles, but there's not anything in the near future on the market. But the future for this is really amazing if you think about the number of diseases that are not vaccinated for around the world, and then could essentially be all but eradicated if everyone could be vaccinated. All right, so what is the big concern of anti-GMO activists in Europe and the United States, besides the other ones we've talked about? Is the unforeseen long-term effects of genetic manipulation in humans as a result of consuming GMO foods, control of the food supply by a small number of seed producers, or insufficient testing of GMO side effects, crop side effects? It is all of these. Right? It's all of these. But we know that there's not insufficient testing, right? In all countries that allow GM products, that actually approve the products, there is a huge amount of testing. It is very rigorous. There is the idea that because those seeds are sterile, we talked about that you would have a small number of companies that are producing the seeds and everybody would have to buy from them. That is an issue, right? That's an issue. But people are buying seeds now, and so we'll have to see where that goes. You cannot have your DNA changed because you ate GMO food. That does not make sense. You cannot change your DNA that way. You don't get mutations from eating food, GMO food. Okay, what about unforeseen long-term effects? This is a really big thing that people get worried about. That there is food safety, that there are food safety concerns, right? What happens if you have random gene insertion and you don't know what is going to cause it? What if you get unknown toxins? What if you get unknown allergies, right? What if you get new products that you've never seen before? These are not issues because of that rigorous testing, right? So this is not something people have to worry about because things that do this never make it out of the lab, right? That's why there's so much testing. All right, so can GMO crops feed a growing population? Yes, right? You can increase yields. Small growers will really benefit this because they don't need large machinery and they can get more profit. You have reduced inputs, which again, on the economic side is lower costs. On the environmental side, it's less chemicals in the environment. Increasing yields because of disease resistance and reduced weed competition, again, increases the amount of food we have and the profit. So you get increased profits, you get increased food. And that is a huge thing. And right now, we don't have anything else that we're doing. So in the absence of something else, this is our best bet right now. So let's switch gears. Let's talk about saving space. How do we get, or actually creating space, how do we do this? Well, vertical farming and rooftop farming. These are the ways, and you're probably familiar with some vertical farming. That would be aquaponics, right? And hydroponics, where you have these cute little shelves, and you see it in walls and things like that, and that's very cool. And we'll come back to that later on. So we're doing a little bit of this already. And rooftop farms are something that are becoming much more popular as well, right? The green roofs, the grasses, right? All these great spaces. The other thing that I'd like to say about rooftop farms is that not only do they produce more food, this is a great way to alleviate food deserts. It gives people jobs in communities. And it's been shown that when you do this on office buildings and things like this, and maybe if you create a little space for people to go and sit and enjoy the day, you can actually increase productivity of office workers as well. So there's a bunch of benefits to that. But when we start thinking about we're sprawling out in our cities, we can reclaim some of that space just on the rooftops. We can do this with farms and we can do it with solar panels so we can get more energy and we can get more agricultural space. And you can do it on a fairly large scale if you have a big building. Now the catch is the buildings have to be built in such a way that you can support all of that weight, that can be support all that weight, but you can retrofit that. You can also turn old features like parking garages or buildings into farms that have multiple levels. right? And so you can see here, you've got multiple levels on what's growing. And this right in the city, you can see some more rooftop gardens here. It's great. Now, you can also do micro farms, and this is where you have wall gardens, and that could be where you have entire walls of buildings that are farms, or it can be within someone's home. This is an apartment garden right here. It can be artistic, it can be in the kitchen, right? You can do all kinds of different things with this, but whatever you're doing, you are in fact increasing food production. Now, the thing about vertical farms is you have to be very thoughtful about how you design them, right? So how would you do that? Vertical farms would rely on hydroponic or aquaponic systems to be effective. True or false? Well, a lot of people think this, but this is not actually true. Vertical farming and hydroponic system are actually completely different. And because they are different and because you build them differently, you can actually do some pretty amazing things, right? You could build or convert whole skyscrapers to be vertical farms. And this is something that's really appealing in a place like Dallas. We have a lot of empty buildings downtown. We have some big food desert problems. It seems like we could really get rid of both of those problems by turning some of those buildings into vertical farms. We create jobs, we create food, and we create a novel solution to some of our infrastructure issues. We create a tourist attraction, we can generate profit. There's all kinds of amazing things that go with this vertical farming, and it would be a really cool thing to see in cities. And whatever cities start doing this, they will be the cities of innovation. These will be the cities of tomorrow. It would be great if Dallas was a city of tomorrow. Okay, whatever we do though, whatever the solution is, we need to be very creative if we want to feed 9 billion people. That is true, very true. Okay, thank you for listening. That is it, and I will see you next time. If you have any questions, make sure you ask at the beginning of class. Thanks very much.